Hello and welcome to the second of this three-part series looking at texturing an asset inside of Mari in 3 stages. From a beginner's point of view, as a more intermediate user, and then finally how I would look at doing it for a day job inside of a VFX studio. Once again, I'm Mike Wild. I'm currently a senior texture artist at ILM London, and in the last video we began as if it was your very first day inside of Mari. In this second part we're going to expand on that a little bit and add some more intermediate Mari techniques to your repertoire. Great, so we're picking up where we left off last time. I've got this blue and red mesh here, and when it comes to texturing this isn't particularly detailed, so let's look at getting some images in here to add a little bit more detail. So I've got some images here inside of a texture library that I've slowly been building up for a number of years, and I recommend doing this when you download or buy some textures. Just make sure to start collecting them so that you've got them all in one place. So I've got this brick texture here. Obviously robots aren't really made out of bricks, but this is a much easier way to demonstrate what's going on under the hood rather than a subtle metal texture, and we can look at believable textures later on, so suspend your disbelief for a minute with me. Okay, so I'm going to drag and drop this into my image manager here, and this is how you get images inside of Mari. If you don't have your image manager open, just click it on the right hand side and that will bring it up. So when I've got this inside of Mari, I can double click it to check it here. I could change the color space options if I wanted to. I could set it to raw data, but this is fine for now. So how do I actually use this? Well, you can right click and go add to node graph as tiled or triplanar here if you wanted to, or you can drag and drop it into your node graph and that will just make it as a tiled texture. So if I double click this, we can see the node properties and I can press 1 to view this. If you wanted to make a tiled node yourself, you can just type in tiled, that will bring it in and it will have no image here, and I can just create that myself exactly the same way. So I'll delete that and I'm going to go to my perspective and UV view here. We can see what's going on. It's basically, it's applying this image across each UDIM the number of times I tell it to repeat. So at the moment it's just doing it once. If I set it to 4 by 4, it will repeat 4 times in the X and the Y across each UDIM. I can also rotate it if I wanted to, but bricks don't go like that. So I'm just going to press the R button here to reset that. Great, so if I view my principal BRDF, obviously you can see that this actually isn't affecting the mesh yet because I haven't merged it in. So I can press tab and type in merge node, or I can just press M on the keyboard, which is a hotkey you're going to become very familiar with, and just put that into my over slot. As we saw in the last video, this is just going to completely overwrite what's underneath. So I'm actually going to change the blending mode this time. So we've got all the blending modes that you'll find in Photoshop. So for example, darken, multiply, lighten. We've got contrast, overlay here, but I'm going to use multiply, and basically where it's black, it's going to keep that information. So I'm going to get the brick lines on top of the colors that we picked in the previous video. Amazing. And if I didn't really like that, I could just bring the opacity down as well. So that's one way to use a procedural inside of Mari. And what do I mean by procedural? Well, basically I mean that this image can be swapped out at any time. The information isn't baked onto my mesh. So I could, if I wanted to change the brick texture here, obviously it's going to look a little bit weird because of that multiply blend mode, but if I viewed that, it's the same node, I could just switch this out anytime if I wanted to. So I'll keep it like this, but let's look at adding a little bit more variation with other kinds of procedurals. So I'm going to delete this tiled node out of here, and I'm going to press tab, and I could start typing in, for example, Perlin, which I know is a procedural, or I can right click again and go to nodes and check out the procedural nodes here. So if I go under pattern, it's got tiled here, which is what we've just been using, but I've got other ones, for example, like an oily spill. I've got different fractals, I've got different noise patterns, I've got this wooden one if I wanted to, which is kind of cool if you have a look at that. And all of these have got all these different parameters that I can change it with. For now, I'm just going to use that cloud one that I saw earlier because I really like the cloud. If we view this, we can see I can change the size of this here. So it's a black and white procedural. I can change the colors if I wanted to. But the reason I really like this is the versatility of the roughness. I can get really soft noise here, or I can get quite a harsh, sharp one. So I'm going to use this to add a little bit of texture variation to the color. So if I view my principal BRDF here, I'm going to merge it on top again. I'm going to put it into the over. Obviously with no mask, it's just going to put it everywhere. But again, I'm going to change the blend mode. This time I'm going to use contrast, overlay, and that will keep the blacks and the whites. And where it's black, it's going to darken it. And where it's white, it's going to lighten it. Obviously it's very extreme at the moment, so I'm just going to bring that down, something like this. And you can see we've now got a little bit of color variation inside of this. So I'm going to change the size, make it a little bit bigger, and I'll just make it a little bit softer. And it's really, really subtle, but that's a lot of what CG texturing is about. It's about adding that subtle breakup so that things don't look super CG anymore. This is great and all, but what if I wanted to start hand painting this data rather than just randomly tiling it across the mesh? Well, I'm glad you asked. I've got this image here in my image manager, which are these nice sort of drips, and I want to add this to my specular to add a little bit of breakup in the roughness. So I want to hand paint this because obviously I want the drips to sort of just be on the edges. So how can we do that? Well, to start painting with an image, projecting with it. I just need to drag this onto my viewport here, and it's going to add it to my viewport. And we've also switched to the paint through tool, and that's the tool that we use to project data inside of Mari. So if your image is too big or too small, you can press Control Shift and that will scale it. You can press Shift to move it, or you can press Control to rotate it. Handily, Mari can by default have the shortcuts for every tool that you're using up on screen. If you don't have that here, so for example, it tells me the scale image is Control and Shift, the move image is just Shift. If you don't have that, you can just go to Edit, HUD Manager, under Tool Manager, just make sure that Tool Help is turned on. And this is really great, especially when you're beginning to use the software, so you can see the tooltips at all times. So to paint this onto my mesh, first of all, I need a paint node to paint into. So I'm going to press P, and because this is mostly black, I'm going to make sure that this paint node begins with all black and is set to scalar data as we discussed in the previous video. Now, if I view this paint node, you can see obviously my mesh, because it's all black, it's quite hard to see. So I'm just going to line it up this light. One little top tip here, I'm just going to go off the paint through tool so we can see this a bit better. If you're ever painting in all black and it's really difficult to see in your viewport like this, just drop down an invert node and then view through that and just invert everything. I sometimes do this, it's just a bit easier to paint with. Obviously your value is going to be inverted, but you can just delete that or disable it as you go. But yeah, for now I'll just line it up to the light. So I want to paint this image in. I'm just going to drag that again. But you can see if I start painting, nothing's actually happening. Well, why is that? So we've got to discuss the paint buffer now, which is probably the most complex topic when it comes to new users of Mari, because it's a really weird way of working versus any other texturing program out there. It really does have its benefits, but it is quite confusing for a new user. There is method to the madness, I swear, but just stick with me here, and I'm going to explain why you probably can't get things painting your mesh to begin with. So let's open up our painting tab here, and I'm just going to bring this out, and I'm going to pin it so we can see this at all times. And I'm going to open up projection settings, and we've got these options called projection. So what is this paint buffer that I'm talking about? Well, basically, Mari has this sort of piece of glass between you and the object. So when you start painting in Mari, you're not actually painting on the object by default. You're painting on this piece of glass that sits between you and the object, and you can manipulate that in any way you want to, which is one of the most powerful things about Mari, and then you can bake that down when you're ready. So by default, it doesn't automatically bake straight away. So to demonstrate the paint buffer, we're going to go through these settings by themselves, not dealing with actually texturing this asset. I'm just going to talk through it and kind of explain it and show what's actually going on under the hood, and it should make a little bit more sense. So what I've done here is I've painted a smiley face on my mesh, and I haven't baked it down yet. So by default, you might not even realize Mari is baking, but it's putting this information on this pane of glass before it bakes onto your mesh. And I can demonstrate this by going here and going to this transform paint buffer tool and clicking on this. And now you can see I've got the tooltips here, but I can click and move this paint around. So let's say I wanted to add the smiley face onto the actual face. I could do that there. I could scale it. And this is when we really start to see what's going on. And if you scale it enough, you will see that this white box that was previously outside of the viewport now comes in, and we can see we've got this 4K and 16-bit square box going on. Now what's this? Well, this is our paint buffer. And now if I was to scroll up to the paint buffer settings, you can see if I were to change this now to 8-bit, this will change. So this is our paint buffer basically that we're seeing. And so what I can do, because this paint isn't yet baked onto our mesh, it's kind of live on this piece of glass, I can move it around, I can rotate it, I can scale it, I can manipulate it in other ways. We've got a lattice here, for example, so I can warp it about. So that's because it's not yet baked onto our mesh. However, if I were to press B on my keyboard or rotate the camera, then we're going to bake it and we're going to see what's going to happen. Now this mesh has actually got this paint data on it. Before it was just on our paint buffer. So I'm going to undo that, and now we're going to talk a little bit about some of these projection settings. So you might actually find when you go to paint inside of the paint through tool or any sort of painting tool inside of Mari that you're not actually able to see anything on your mesh. So for example, I'm painting, but nothing's happening. Well, why is that? Often it's because we've got this setting here called project on selected only. So currently I actually don't have anything in our scene selected. So I've got it set to patch selection mode. And if I were now to select this patch selection, you can see that that paint was already on my paint buffer, but it wasn't actually going to put it on the mesh because that part of the mesh wasn't selected. So I can do the same thing. Now we can demonstrate this. I don't have the head selected, and you can see that it's only going through the neck. If I were to now select the head, then it would, if I wanted to bake that, it would bake it onto this part of the mesh. I can also change this to face, for example. So I can just do certain faces, or I can have it set to the whole object, and that way it's just going to paint regardless. You can also change this setting to just all, and then that means it will paint on everything at once. I personally really like the selected only because it just means I don't accidentally get paint data in places that I don't want it, which can happen a lot in Mari, especially on complex objects. So let's talk about this next setting, projection. And I'm going to demonstrate this again with a little smiley face because apparently they're my favorite. And so by default, it's set to front, and basically this means it's only going to project on the front of the mesh. However, if you wanted to do also the back side of the mesh at the same time, you could also do through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press B on that to bake this. And now it will have projected this onto the back side of the mesh as well. Now this is fine if you have very specific reasons that you want to do this. Sometimes it's really, really useful, but I always have this set to front because it's quite annoying when you accidentally get paint data on the back that you then have to go and get rid of. But I just wanted to demonstrate that this is possible to do. So this next option, the bake behavior, we've got 3 settings here. Auto bake and clear is the default, and then we've got one called manual and one called clear only. So by default, the way that Mari bakes is if you were to press B on the keyboard, it would bake it onto the mesh, or if you were to rotate the camera as well and kind of turn around the object, it would automatically bake. So often you don't even realize that Mari is baking. So for new users, this whole paint buffer thing seems quite complex because you might not even realize what's going on under the hood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Alt to rotate, and you're going to see down here, it's going to be thinking for a very small amount of time because it's not particularly complex here, but that's it baking onto the mesh. So let's do that. So there you can see that's baked it. So if I draw that again, let's have a look at this other setting. So we've also got this mode called manual and this mode called clear only. So if I change this to manual now, and if I were to move, you can see that this paint is no longer baking onto the mesh automatically. It's actually still on my paint buffer. So what I can do is I can press B to bake it again, and it stays on my paint buffer because it hasn't cleared it out, and I can just stamp these weird little smiley faces all over my mesh. So this is really useful if, for example, you had like a screw that you wanted to sort of just dot over a hard surface object. But it also can be a little bit annoying because then I have to go and manually clear my paint buffer myself by pressing this button. And you have to remember to bake it as well. So that's why by default, the auto bake and clear is quite good for beginners. And this clear only mode, so let me show you this. So if I were to do a smiley face, I can move it around. It's not auto baking, but when I do bake, if I press B, it's going to clear that paint buffer so I don't have that information on there anymore. And we're not going to talk about this projection filter because that doesn't really matter. So that's the quite important settings about the paint buffer and kind of what's going on under the hood with Mari. Hopefully that makes a bit more sense now with what's going on. So mini paint buffer tutorial done, and I'm going to go back to my original scene, back to my original settings, and I'm going to create a new paint node. And I'm just going to drag and drop this. I'm just going to paint some detail onto the front of my mesh. I've got the wireframe turned on just to sort of see it a little bit better. I'm just going to sort of put it around the top section of this. Just like that. And then I can, if I rotate the camera or I press the B key, that's going to bake that down onto my mesh. And so it's a little bit haphazard. We can see this line here, it doesn't look great, but I'm aware of time. So I'm going to view the principal BRDF here. And obviously this isn't changing my specular at all. So I need to merge that in. So I press M on this, and I'm going to change tools so I'm no longer seeing this image on top. And again, if I put this to over, we'll see that when I view my specular roughness, it's gone from this value that we set up before, and it's just ignoring that because we've just merged it over. So if I change the blend mode from normal to lighten, what it's going to do is it's going to keep that bottom value, but anything that's white, so these drips, is going to add that on top, and it's going to ignore the black here. So I'll get my value from before, but I'll get these drips. Now when I view this, you can see that we've got some breakup where these drips are, but I would say it's a little bit too much breakup. So instead of just using this value, because white is a very strong value for specular roughness, I'm actually going to use this as a mask. So where I've got white in these drips, it's going to add this new value that I pump in, and where it's got black, it's not going to change it at all. So I'll add a new constant, and I'm going to set that to something like 0.6, because that will just add a nice bit of roughness. I'm also going to get rid of this painting tab. And you can see now, if I turn my wireframe off, where these drips are. If I view this, where the drips are, it's a value of 0.6, and I can change this at any time. So I prefer the workflow of painting into masks and then using those masks to control values that I can change, rather than just using the pure data that I paint to define the values, because it's just a little less procedural. You can't kind of change things on the fly. So what I can do now is I can sort of look dev this almost here. I can change the constant value to just get a little bit of breakup where this grime is that I've painted now. Great. So this video's gone on a little bit longer than I wanted it to originally, but I'm going to wrap this up by just adding a few more details, kind of adding some extra channels and sort of closing out this second video, ready for the third one where I'm going to texture an asset and actually make it look good rather than it looks like currently. So I've got this PNG sort of transparent image here that I'm going to drop onto my mesh. So let's add this into the diffuse, and I'm going to use a merge node, but this time because it's transparent, when I add a paint node, I'm going to set the alpha to be 0, and now I've got a transparent paint node. It's not going to be scalar data, so I'm going to untick that, and I'm just going to put that into my over slot, and now I'm painting into this node with my mesh selected because I have the selection mode for painting on. If I drag and drop this, scale this up, I can add this cool little decal that I got from this guy's pack on Gumroad. Just rotate that slightly and paint that over, press B to bake, and then now I've got that on my mesh here, and that's just a nice little bit of detail there. I could add another one if I wanted, say for example here. I can also stamp this. You can see here I've got this option called stamp, which is just this apostrophe key here. If I stamp that, then I didn't even have to paint that myself. It's automatically done that for me, and that's perfect. So when it does bake, it adheres to the pixel resolution that my paint node is set to, so 4K. So you can see when I zoom in, actually it's a little bit pixelated, but that's because realistically, I'm not going to see this ever this close up. And if I were going to, then I just need to make the size of this paint node, instead of 4K when I set it up, I'd have to set it to 8K. And that's just the reality of texel density, texel resolution, but that's a whole nother topic. So anyway, so I've added a little bit more texture detail there. And what I'm going to do is, you know what, I've decided I don't want this to be yellow anymore. I want this to actually be black and white. So I can use a HSV node. So I can press tab and type in HSV, and this is hue saturation value if you're familiar with sort of Photoshop and things like that. And when I've got this selected, it's just going to automatically add this here, and I can change the saturation, for example. I'm going to set this to 0, and now that's turned to white, and I could also just bring down the value if I wanted it to be black. And that's just a way to sort of color correct on the fly. You've got a few nodes like that, like levels, for example, which is similar to levels in other programs. But also if I go to nodes, a whole load of them here under filter. So if you want to do other things like contrast, HSL, so hue saturation light instead of hue saturation value. We've got hue shift, all these things, they're in here if I wanted to do that. So that's just showing you how to color correct things on the fly. So I've got a nice little bit of detail there. So that's great and all, but currently it's looking a little bit flat. So I could make, for example, something to go into my bump. So I've actually switched out to a Principal BRDF shader network. If you're using this one, you don't have access to the bump channel, but shader network does. So I switched out to that, and now I've got the bump. So I'm just going to create a quick channel like we did in video 1. I'm just going to call this bump. 4K, 8-bit, scalar is fine. Actually, I might make this 16-bit because it's black and white map, just to give me a little bit more bit depth. And we'll put that in there. I'm going to add that to my bump slot. Nothing's going to happen because obviously we've got nothing in there. But now if I were to use, let's say, a purlin and drag that into there, you'll see that this does start to affect it now. You can now see that my surface is getting a little bit of breakup, which is quite nice. So I'm going to scale it like this and just make it really, really small like that. And now you can see I've got a little bit of breakup there. Obviously it's not perfect, it's quite extreme. So you know what, I'm just going to put in a merge node. I'm going to make this my over, and I'll just set a constant of 0.5 because that's no bump value. And I'm just going to now use the opacity slider. If we view this as my bump channel, I'm just going to use my opacity slider to bring this down and make it a lot less contrasted. So 0 obviously just shows this 0.5 value, which means no bump. And then black means it pushes in, white means it pushes out, which is why we're getting that really extreme detail there with this really small purlin. But if I were to view this, let's just bring this down to something like 0.1. And you can now see I've got a nice little bit of breakup there. And again, I could change the scale if I wasn't liking that, but it just makes it a little bit lumpy. So I actually quite liked how it was. Cool, yeah. So now that we've got that bump detailing on there, you can see that we've started to build some slightly more advanced textures than we had at the end of video 1. So I'm going to bring this video to a close here. In part 3, we're going to combine all the techniques we've used so far to look at getting textures that match an object that we see in real life, which is your kind of job as a VFX artist. But in this video, we covered some of the fundamentals that we're going to need to do that. So we've covered looking at using procedurals, using different blending modes inside of our merge node to add complexity on top of our node graph that we had so far. And we also looked at using images to add detail, whether that be procedurally with the tiled node or painting with the paint through tool into a paint node and sort of hand painting some breakup here. So join me in part 3, where we're going to combine all this and you'll see my process as a VFX artist and how I would actually texture this if it was assigned to me at work. Thanks very much. I've been Michael Wild, and I'll see you in the next part.